Today, we are joined by Diana Chan McNally. In many ways, Diana is the ideal person for discussing how to advocate for change from the front lines. She's a frontline worker. She's an advocate. She works every day with people who may not be able to stand up for themselves or may not be heard. And if you're not personally acquainted with Diana, you've likely seen, heard, or read about her in the media. You could say she claims a special place in the landscape. She's a unique kind of trusted expert. She is somebody who can humanize people who are unhoused based on her intimate knowledge of their situations and also understands the bigger implications and the required policy asks. During the summer last year, the refugee shelter crisis came to a head here in downtown Toronto. Diana has played no small part in bringing attention to this issue and getting action. If you've seen her in the media, you might recall that she chose a small detail to highlight the situation, namely people with trench foot in the summer. This is not 1919, she told the CBC. We're not at war. And just this past January, she applied the same pressure again. The detail this time was how to stave off frostbite. Both times, she chose these details, and she helped us understand graphically the effects on people when governments abdicate their duties and how their inaction brought about the situation we're in. And so, Diana Chan McNally, a policy school alumni, I'd like to add, is here to share how she does what she does, how to advocate for change from the front line. Diana, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. And what a generous introduction. And thank you all for being here today. So I kind of just want to start with my first idea, which is to not be afraid of advocacy. And I know I say advocacy, it's this weird thing that I do. So please try and get used to it while I'm talking. I know it's a little bit odd. To be perfectly honest, I actually used to be really afraid of advocacy. So as a kid, both of my parents were high school teachers, and both were also members of the union, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, or OSSTF. For those of you who remember the 90s, even if you were a kid like me, even the vaguest memories, you might actually remember that this was the time of former Premier Mike Harris's cuts to education. So that meant that both of my parents were actually on strike, and my school was affected as well. And so my dad would actually take me to rallies with him, and we would march together. And I do remember the kind of vibrancy and energy of those strike actions. It's very burned into my brain. Now, that said, somehow along the way, I actually changed my mind about civic actions like rallies. I actually, for a period of time, thought they were vulgar. I know. What people did when they couldn't articulate themselves better, because that's what a lot of people come to believe because of the ongoing and right now very much increasing rhetoric that protest is uncivil, it's uncouth, and not a charter protected right, which is useful to make people believe if you want to actually suppress any kind of dissent, and make the public think rather that civil disobedience or public dissent of most any kind is somehow uncivilized. So honestly, I was not involved in politics at all. And actually really strongly self-identified as someone who hated talking about politics until I started working in the field that I work in now, which is homelessness services. And I started almost 10 years ago in 2014. And really during that period of time and until 2019, that really active understanding and interest in how everyone I was working with was systematically excluded in political participation of any kind. It really never was much more than thoughts in my head or a conversation with a colleague or maybe a Facebook post at best. But in 2019, that's when I went to go work for the Toronto Drop-In Network. So on my second day of work, my boss essentially threw me to the wolves and made me depute to city council. It was my second day of work, which I had never done before. And it was on a topic that at the time I really didn't actually know much about, which was the Fair Fare Pass. So I had to learn overnight what the thing was and what it is we were asking for, and then depute for 5 minutes to city councilors. Needless to say, I was, excuse my language, scared shitless by having to do this. So former councillor Mike Layton, he asked me a question after my deputation, and it was actually a friendly one. It was a leading question, actually, to try to get me to confirm what he also wanted to push at council. But I was just sweating bullets, trying not to sound completely incompetent, which I think I managed to pull off, although I think since then I've gotten a lot better. This is all to say that I actually really do know what it's like to be scared to advocate for change, at least at an individual level. I always wanted to take kind of a backseat and not be very directly involved. But since I was thrown headfirst into this kind of advocate work, and I've said to my old boss, Susan Bender, you kind of created a monster, and she'll laugh, and it's kind of true. For me, there is no actual going back. So before, when I was only working frontline with people who are unhoused, basically I was applying bandages to a problem that was persistently getting worse. But I discovered in becoming an advocate this complementary work to push back on those systems rather and policies that were worsening the problem while still remaining directly tied to the issues on the ground as a frontline worker. Now, none of us has limitless capacity to throw money, resources, labor, your entire emotional wellness into a black hole or what, those gaps in social safety net happen to be. So pushing back is also about making care work sustainable for you, knowing that you have agency and ability to help change the conditions that create the poverty that surrounds you every single day. So organizationally, I know that agencies have chilled significantly, not chill, but chilled rather, around advocating for change. And I know in no small part, this is really coming out of the Stephen Harper years when we were told, our agencies were told that if we spent more than 10% of our budget on political work, and that was never really defined, it was very amorphous, that we were all under threat of being defunded. So if we actually spoke out, we could potentially lose that government funding. So many of our funding contracts today, and I know when you contract with the City of Toronto, for example, they still include clauses stating that you cannot criticize the government funder as a condition of that funding. So I understand the kind of context that we're coming out of where organizationally we've been told, you will be threatened with losing your funding if you speak out. But I have to say I'm sure some of the EDs who maybe hear some of the managers, materially, our work is getting so much worse, significantly worse. It's completely unmanageable. And you know this because you can't retain the staff. The need and the condition of the people that we exist to support is getting far worse on a daily basis. And that is not going to change on its own. The money that we need to operate isn't increasing proportionately to meet that need, not in the slightest. So you know how bad it is. So at some point, the funding that we receive isn't worth the insurmountable issues that government expects us to manage in their absence, instead of legislating solutions and redistributing resources that would actually solve those problems. So being an advocate, advocacy, it's not something to fear, especially at this moment. It's something that should be embraced, understanding that our work, it just isn't viable anymore. And frankly, our work shouldn't exist at all. We only exist because of those gaps in the social safety nets. So our job ultimately is to put ourselves out of work. And a great way to do that is to be an advocate.
So there's a lot there. How do you think about bringing that experience, that frontline work that what you've just described so graphically? How do you bring that into your advocacy? How do you keep that there?
Yeah, so continuing to work frontline really kind of allows me to stay connected in this very, very real way to what is happening in the moment on the ground and to be able to contextualize that at both kind of the macro and the meso levels. So take the failure of the right to housing, for example. So the complete non-existence of a service or program to address a particular need. What I see on the ground, I can connect that to those certain gaps, either at very, very macro level again, or kind of at the meso level. And it allows me to be very nimble in my advocacy so I can see immediately what's happening and be able to turn that around into a public conversation far more quickly than if I didn't have that actual connection. So I'll also say that working frontline and having that kind of knowledge also, not to be like, oh, look at me, but it makes me credible in a way that can't be replicated. And that's the truth. So we're often seeking out frontline voices, not so much in my sector, and I'll get into why that might be, but doctors, for example, ER doctors, nurses, especially during the pandemic, those were the voices that we were seeking out because of the credibility that they were lending to the conversation that others simply did not have. I'll kind of tell you a bit of a story. So, Elizabeth, you kind of already mentioned this, but over the past several months, I've been working with African refugees. And part of why I got involved is that I'd never seen anything like this before, where people were abandoned on the street by the dozens, hundreds, without any resources whatsoever. So myself and a small group of volunteers, Lorraine Lamb was among them, we started to raise money. And so we had intended to raise $3,000, and that was just for water, and it escalated into over $80,000 for any kind of emergency aid. So whatever people needed, tents, water, blankets, food, shoes, menstrual supplies, clothing, we would buy that for them and actually arrange these kinds of drop-offs. Again, it's not as though people have been treated very well when they're on the street, but I had never seen a situation where even water was something that was not being distributed to people. It was completely egregious. So I kind of stepped in for months, unpaid, to be able to address the situation. So Lorraine basically handled the supply drop-offs, and what I was doing was a lot more of the kind of quote unquote political work. So speaking with politicians, co-organizing press conferences, engaging in media work, working with a lot of other groups, and there are many groups working on this, especially Black-led organizations, working with them to try and amplify their voices and ensure that they also had resources and funding in order to do the work that they needed to do. So for months, and we saw this, the federal government refused to take any responsibility. They would deflect at any chance they were given to say, this is especially a provincial priority. This is something the province should be doing. But ultimately, refugees, as we know, are a federal responsibility. So I was trying to use my frontline perspective in a strategic way. I would speak to the realities on the ground, things like trench foot, which I did see, things like frostbite. We were extremely worried that people would start losing fingers and toes because they don't know what frostbite is. They've never encountered this kind of cold where that could even happen before. I would speak to those realities that I was seeing and use that as a kind of point of pain that I could cause in particular to federal MPs to make them look both callous as well as out of touch, which quite frankly, given the situation, that's exactly what they were. And I use that to help rally public opinion and also create public pressure. So those small details, again, I like to use kind of point of pain. That's the way I kind of describe it. Something that actually is going to push somebody in a way and kind of create that sort of negative public perception or perception that they should be doing something. Now, that said, it took a very long time to finally push the feds to a point where they did take responsibility. And it wasn't solely me, obviously. There was, again, so many people involved in this. And a week before, however, the feds finally committed $143 million to the city of Toronto for refugee relief. And this happened in late January, early February. I had authored an op-ed in the Toronto Star, which was written from the perspective of a frontline worker. So what I did is that I built on the messages that I had been communicating for months now, that people had been abandoned, that politicians were choosing partisanship over people's lives, that the federal government must take responsibility for the thousands of refugees in Toronto's shelter system and on the streets. So those were the primary messages that I wanted to communicate through that frontline lens. And what I learned afterward, and I kind of laughed because I take a certain schadenfreude in this, a certain former Liberal Toronto MP had planned to write a counterpoint to the op-ed that I had written in the Toronto Star about how there were no refugees in the Toronto shelter system. But if you're going to make a statement like that, you have to have that frontline experience. You have to be on the ground to make a statement like that and make it be credible. So he actually capitulated instead of actually writing this counterpoint op-ed, partly because if it were a war between my word and his word, ultimately, my frontline experience made me far more credible than him. So again, that wasn't the reason why we got the money. It was months and months and months of buildup, but it certainly didn't hurt. And using, again, that frontline perspective really is something that I did use to cause pain to make sure that that money did flow.
You create a powerful visual that you can't let go of, but at the same time, you're also taking it away from a theoretical policy debate and making it about very real lived experience, people's lives, and you can point to those people and it becomes very tangible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was really important because the conversation that they wanted to shift to was that it was bickering between levels of government, which it certainly was, but there was a very real consequence to this that they didn't want to talk about because they knew that they couldn't win, essentially, if we brought that to the forefront of the conversation. So, and I went to policy school. I'm very acquainted with making policy arguments, but ultimately the saleable argument I could make was not a policy one. It was frontline driven.
So what's the win that you're looking for in all of that?
Um, it really depends, I think. In certain situations, it's like when you're advocating around a particular issue, I tend to structure my work around what can we feasibly win. So what is the context that we're operating in? What or who are the barriers? What resources do we have? Who are our allies in the situation? What's achievable in that entire mix? And I think a lot of the time, this is my criticism of the left, I say this as someone who's obviously sitting toward the left, we tend to think very big. Statements like housing for all. Yes, obviously, yes, this is absolutely what is needed. But what we're very bad at, what we're poor at, is structuring a path to actually getting there. So, you have to be very pragmatic about this, and we have to work incrementally. We're not going to get to a point of suddenly housing for all is going to appear unless we have a plan, step by step, incremental, to actually get us to that point. So I know that can be extremely frustrating, obviously, because working incrementally when so much is going so wrong right now does not feel great. Like, I understand that you want to be further than where you ultimately are, but from a pragmatic perspective, I think we need to set goals and targets that actually are achievable in order to realize those big ideas ultimately. So there is no housing for all without realizing that people need shelter right now. That we need rights and protections for encampment residents right now. And until that housing is built, there has to be a pragmatic plan along every step of the way. So I guess when I see those goals and targets being reached, and again, they are sometimes not very big at all, that's what I look for. So it's never a straight path. Even if you have this like grand plan to get to where you want to be, there's going to be curveballs all along the way. And you don't always win, obviously, everything that's needed when you need it. But being an advocate does mean you have to be able to play the long game and be able to stay the course and adapt, even when there's challenges and there's disappointment. Another thing that I also look for are shifts in public discourse. There's ultimately no winning unless you can effectively bring the public largely on side. And I think that's something the left also doesn't understand, because we exist in our echo chambers, but ultimately we aren't necessarily trying to reach people who aren't already in agreement with us, which is problematic. You have to start to reach out to people who may not even be acquainted with these issues at all, but to make them passionate about them or make them care, or at least have an opinion that might actually be on side with you. It's a real feat, however, to get there, obviously. For instance, however, and there were many, many, many people reiterating this message. So evicting encampments only creates harm in the absence of safe, decent housing and shelter. I've noticed recently, actually, like very ordinary people, not people who are political, who are concerned about encampments, but instead of outright demands that they be removed, like just get rid of these people, throw them away, who knows where they go, it doesn't matter. What I'm hearing people say is that we need to make sure that these people can safely go indoors, safely being a real key word here. And I've heard some politicians who weren't initially on side starting to say it too. And that's a win, and miles away from the overall sentiment that we saw in the city of Toronto in 2021, when we had these very militarized encampment evictions in the city. So that's a win, that we managed to shift the discourse that far, that it's not just about remove these encampments, it's about, do we actually have some better alternative for people? Because that's ultimately what they need. It takes a lot and years to shift discourse or to make any wins a lot of the time. So I'll offer a little bit of something that I've learned in doing this work, is that moral demands don't work. Appealing to someone in power on the basis of morality, that goes absolutely nowhere. Similarly, personally attacking someone and their reputation also doesn't really work. It can feel cathartic, and you might get a little bit of like, haha, out of that, really. But it can also exacerbate a political situation or shift the focus from the actual outcomes you want into an interpersonal fight, which is not a productive thing to do. Same with believing, sadly, it's so sad to me, that facts and evidence alone can be persuasive. They aren't to a lot of people. Some people, they don't care at all about that, even if you care about it and it makes sense to you. Politically, people are ideological, and so they're not necessarily persuaded by these arguments. So arguing that something is like morally or ethically correct, or that it's evidence-based, that actually isn't a surefire way to create political change. It just is not, and this is what I've learned. It's not wrong, obviously, to use these arguments, but they rarely work on their own. So, okay, I'm gonna go on to my tip. I'm sorry, I'm just like talking too much. What do? Create leverage. So I learned this actually in my brief time when I was working as a legislative assistant at Queen's Park. I decided to try it out. I was pretty sure I wasn't going to like it, and I absolutely did not like it. But I learned a lot while I was there, which has been very useful. So progressive politics is not about claiming moral superiority, which is a mistake that we make all of the time on the left. It's about advocating for better outcomes, tangible, real outcomes for people using a moral lens. And that usually means using negotiation. And in a negotiation, what you need is leverage. So in the case for advocating for refugees, to come back to this, I use my frontline credibility as leverage. I also use sensitivity around partisanship as leverage. I worked with coalitions of many civil society organizations and leaders to create that leverage. And of course, the city hall eventually was on side, and having a whole other order of government is also a form of leverage. So I will leave you with that leverage is actually incredibly important when you're doing this kind of work, and just saying that's bad, you shouldn't do that, or the facts say this, sadly, don't generally work on their own.
So that's very strategic, and it's tangible. You've got tangible outcomes. So like we've gone through some of your at the beginning. Don't be afraid of advocacy. Be bold. Be real. Break down the barriers. Reach to the actual experience. Be smart. Have these tangible, achievable goals. Be strategic. How do you protect yourself in all of that? That's a lot going on. And by the way, you're still dealing with very life and death issues on a daily basis with people.
Yeah. How do I protect myself? It can be very exhausting. But I want to be clear, at least for myself. I can only speak to my own experience. It's not the actual work of supporting people that I find hard. It's watching people who never actually have anything materially improve in their lives, which is through no fault of their own, obviously, because of the horrific conditions we actually create for them, and expect to suffer through indefinitely. That's the stuff that actually burns me out, is watching day after day people's lives never improving because we never give people the resources to actually get there. So I actually find doing advocate work is energizing in itself. I can only, again, speak to myself. Other people might not feel the same way. That's fair. But it gives me back that sense of agency to actually make a real difference, a real change systemically, that many of us, we kind of feel deprived of having that kind of agency, especially when you are on the front line. So I actually consider doing this work a form of self-care. I hate using that word. I have a lot of crankiness about the word self-care. Of course, we need to take good care of ourselves as much as we can, but we can't put the onus on each individual to take full responsibility for and control over their personal wellness. It's obviously just like not up to each individual person alone. So, glasses of wine, a massage, spa day, even if you can afford those things, which are sold to us as self-care, they're a reprieve and not a solution to the reasons why we feel so awful. And that's capitalism. So our focus should be on collective care, which in the absence of care from the state does mean mutual aid, which in my opinion actually is the most radical thing that we can engage in many ways. So that said, it's hard to find that collective care because we're very hyper individualistic in our society, and we're very resistant to this idea that we should be taking care of each other. And we can't necessarily afford the forms of self-care that are marketed to us. But you can still find joy in your work, outside of work. So in my work, since especially I started doing this advocate work, I've met people who just absolute joy, people that I will know for life. And I love being with them, and not just necessarily in the context of doing this work, but they're bringing positivity to everything they do, and we have amazing relationships and care for each other. I also find enjoy just taking a walk. I walk home every day from work, which is about 6 kilometers, but it's a good way for me to clear my head, and it's free. So it's very helpful to do. And I also, maybe you see my records behind me. That's my thing, that when nothing else is really giving me a lot of joy in the moment, this is what gives me joy, is music, actually. So I will say to everybody, try and find that thing that buoys you, whatever it is. And I also understand some of the caveats of being able to afford certain things, because that's a reality. But everyone does need that thing that brings light and joy into your life when very little else does. And I think in my 5 good ideas, I mentioned, like, even if you can't make much time for rest, I get that, because I'm probably talking to fellow frontline workers. And if you're working frontline in homelessness services, you probably have at least 2 jobs. I know I do. So it's not possible to afford to do this work without having some kind of side hustle, or something else that you're doing entirely. So the rest part and the time part, I know, are extremely limited. But finding something that gives you joy, even if it's not you taking a nap, it's a way to rest your mind and your soul, because you're finding that joy, and it gives you a similar feeling and allows you to actually decompress for a moment. So if you can't sleep, find something that makes you happy.
That's great. Thank you, Diana. That was so honest, and there was just packed full of ideas. Before we leave the last one, I mean, finding joy and finding the thing that is right for you, that regenerates you, and that sort of thing, that is so important. But you also referenced, I think, in 2 different ways, systemic issues around this. And you talked about mutual aid, and I'd like you to just break that out a little bit. What do you mean by mutual aid? And then you also spoke, I think, quite directly to the conditions of work, that how are we as a society, as our social systems and structures, actually taking care of decent work conditions for those who are providing the work that you're providing? So I don't comment on those 2 things.
Well, they're not. We're not being taken care of at all. And for those of us who are working in the fields, especially if you were unionized, you would have been capped by Bill 124 for 4 years almost, which is to say a lot of people actually just left the sector entirely because it became unaffordable. Again, because of that burnout, not necessarily from working with people who, to me, it's a joy to work with people all the time. But again, to see the level of need and more people, and not having the support you need to be able to continue to do that care work in a good way. This is another reason why organizations start to need to advocate as well, for the conditions that your workers are existing in, because the reality is that it is not acceptable. And this is because, again, we don't value care work. This is true of nurses, this is true of teachers, this is true of like PSWs, ECEs, people like myself. This kind of work is wholesale devalued, especially at the political level. So there's no money coming in for these programs. And I'm very fundamentally aware of that, which is why we need to start to advocate, again, not just for the people that we're supporting, but we can't even do that work if we don't have staff anyway. So you also need to be advocating for your staff and pushing back against this idea that it's acceptable for someone to making $21 an hour to do some of the toughest work that exists. To your point about the mutual aid, so mutual aid has always existed, but the pandemic, I think, really kind of clarified this like new sort of iteration of mutual aid, where people who couldn't necessarily afford to cook, people were creating meals for each other, redistributing resources. If you needed something, there was a network you could connect to, and potentially someone could help you get that thing or support you. That kind of stuff is incredible. And we have community fridges now, for example, which are somewhat entrenched. And yes, that's still emergency food, but it's food by the community for the community. And what better way to push back against the state failure, essentially, to take care of us, that we actually start to create these kinds of systems ourselves, that are creating community care.
So important. So you've talked a lot about it. I mean, your life is focused on supporting people who are most vulnerable in attaining a dignity for themselves and a better situation. What, in your mind, are the best ways to assist people who are vulnerable, who are marginalized, to find and use their own voice in support of self-advocacy and advocacy on behalf of others. So how do you manage that line?
It's really hard. And I think at this point, it's hard for people to have enough stability to start to consider like more of these kinds of political and systemic contexts. Not that they don't, but if you're focused on survival, that's always going to be the first thing that you're concerned about, obviously. So how do we get people into spaces of stability when we don't have a lot of resources to be able to do that? So, every day you can ask somebody, how can I help? What would be helpful right now? Everyone's going to say housing. I don't have a lot of ability to get that for people. Here and there, I am able to house people, but honestly, I know people who have not been able to house a client in years at this point. So those are the kinds of barriers that we face to getting people the stability they need to rest and start to again address in much more tangible ways what's actually happening, and creating these systems that oppress people so horrifically. That said, it's like we have the Toronto Unhoused Union, and they're doing really cool work. So it's for people who are currently unhoused, people who have been recently unhoused or have any kind of life experience. So it's a way, again, of creating that mutual aid support within that union, and using that support network as a way to actually advocate. So they actually come to All Saints where I work, and we host their monthly meeting. So that's another interesting point for organizations as well. How are you working in solidarity with your communities? Are you giving people space for things like this? Could you give people space for things like this? And that would be invaluable, I think, because there's very few places that kind of allow these very like on the ground grassroots movements to thrive, in our more kind of, in our agency spaces.
Yeah. And it's a call to think about physical space, other resources, other assets that are attached to the organization that can be useful and part of
Yeah.
the overall advocacy. I'm going to remind people that are joining us on the webinar that they can put questions to you directly into the Q&A box. That last question came from there. I'm going to go to some other questions that came in advance. And I want you to go back to, you talked a bit about understanding when you've had impact, but how do you personally evaluate the impact of your advocacy, not in terms of outputs? And I think you talked a bit about this. It's progress. It's smaller steps and so forth. But when you think about impact, how do you reconcile that, or how do you do that evaluation, either for yourself or for your organization, and communicating that to All Saints and having them understand the value of the time that you spend doing the other things with media, with politicians, and so forth?
I'm not sure that is understood. It is not interfered with, and I will take it. But I think, broadly speaking, our sector does not consider that kind of work as actual labor. You might only see me on television. You might see Lorraine here and there. Sometimes you'll see Greg Cook. It's pretty telling that you're only seeing essentially three faces most of the time, because this isn't considered, again, labor. It's always something that you should be doing side at desk or on your own time, when it does ultimately benefit everybody, and including the organizations that are a little bit apprehensive about being involved or supporting frontline workers. Don't be afraid of people like us. We can be absolute assets, to your agencies. But I will say, on a personal level, because we don't have that, it's actually caused a lot of problems for me in my own life and actually finding work, because cowgirls like me, maybe we're hard to control, or that's the kind of mindset that exists. So it has actually limited my job prospects, which is a risk that people should be aware of, because we don't have the kind of environment that's very supportive of folks like me. Now, I know that wasn't what the question was about, but evaluating, for myself, again, it's very amorphous sometimes to be able to kind of be like, this made a difference. But again, if I'm starting to see especially public discourse change, that's when I start to be like, okay, this is actually something that made a difference. Sometimes it's something very concrete, like suddenly you got that funding in when you weren't sure that funding was going to come in. Otherwise, it's hard to know. If something changes, we get new services, new programs, some kind of resource, that's a way of evaluating the metric. I think personally, I'm always just focused on the next thing that I often don't even consider evaluating whether I've been effective or not. And I often don't even watch my own media clips and that kind of stuff because it just seems, I don't know, seems a little distasteful to review it. But I know
It's
that's
a
a
hard
terrible
thing to do.
answer.
No, it's a hard
Yeah.
thing to do. Nobody likes to watch themselves on video or on the radio or listen to themselves on the radio. Um, there's a number of questions coming. What would you say has been your most memorable moment? Like you've had so many moments. Someone has since you started working the front lines, and out of everything you've done, what has been your most memorable? What has really struck you as either has motivated, inspired you to do more, or just really held as a touch point for you?
My most memorable moment. I think that would be working on some of the encampment policy stuff that I was working on, especially, and I'm still doing, but in 2021 especially. Um, we were at a point where, again, the public narrative was all over the place, but largely what we saw is a lot of folks in the city were just not on side with encampments existing because there was nothing else that was even remotely okay for people to actually access. So there was a point after these horrific evictions, and then it was just me going to a park with some other advocates as well as some people who were living in encampments, and then just coming up with a set of policy directives for the city of Toronto. I don't know why I decided that would be a good way to do things, but I had already been writing policy for our entire sector on COVID protocols because we didn't have any protocols. Our sector was left out of everything that government was saying and doing. So it became my job to actually do that work. So I had to have a kind of very crash course in how to do or how to create policy, essentially. But I think I learned a lot from that. And so it kind of really sticks out in my mind because governments are also lazy. It's something that sticks out for me because if you just give them what they need, sometimes they'll just take it and do it directly. In this case, that didn't actually happen. We had about 5 counselors who supported the policy directives that we created. So they weren't actually implemented, but they did inform policy from that in a very indirect way. But subsequently, I've actually written motions for counselors. Be like, you know what? Instead of saying you should do this, I'm just going to do it for you. Here you go. Would you like to implement it? So it really strikes me as this kind of turning point where I was just like, oh, you can actually sometimes get things done because people don't want to necessarily do it themselves. So you can do it for them.
Um, so here's a sort of navigating those hierarchies and those bureaucracies. How do you navigate power structures and hierarchies that legitimize some people's knowledge over others? So some have found frontline workers are often denigrated as naive and not focused on the big picture. And so then following on that, how important is it to have champions and allies in these positions that will create space? I think you just talked about, building allyship with counselors and leveraging their influence. But um, has that been a struggle for you, and how have you navigated that?
Oh, absolutely. Again, working frontline, especially in our field, I don't think we're very respected as workers, and certainly not as people with any intellectual capacity to consider the big picture, which is fundamentally incorrect. Most of us are actually very good at seeing those big pictures because we see at the micro level all of this happening every day, and we can connect it in a very direct way to what's actually missing, those resources at, again, the meso and the macro level. I think we're some of the best thinkers in terms of these things. It galls me a little bit. I try my best to push back on that. And demonstrate in a very real way that yes, we can think actually, and we are able to connect these things to actual policy that exists out there. Again, these kinds of service gaps that exist. So how do we change that narrative? That's a tricky one. Again, our work is just not valued, and that is true at every possible level. So political participation is included in that, and also when it comes to things like research. We are often not involved when people do studies, research around what is happening in terms of homelessness, for example. We're often the voice that is left out. They may talk not nearly enough to people experiencing homelessness. They may talk to people higher up in management, executive director levels, but oftentimes the frontline voice is left out when, again, we are the ones who can make those connections between what happens on the ground and what is not happening elsewhere. So All I can do is try and model that we're not we're not incompetent. We know what we're talking about, and that's, I think, the best that I can do. But I would love to be able to create more space for people who can speak to these issues, because it shouldn't just be me and Lorraine Lamb and Greg Cook. We need to have more voices, because I think the more that we have, again, we can kind of push back against a lot of public narratives, and very unfortunate narratives when you have multiple people speaking to the same thing. So I think organizationally, that means that we have to be able to lift people up, give them opportunities to speak. Can we have an advocate bureau in our agencies, for example, or committee? Can we support people to get media training? What does that look like? Again, I leave that to you, but those are just a couple of mechanisms that could exist to bring more of these kinds of voices, my voice, for example, into the public sphere.
Excellent set of suggestions. So frontline workers are often really interested and, I think inspired by the work that you're doing and others like you, that you can have that voice, right? But they don't always know how to do that, how to get into that, and how to be seriously considered in doing that kind of work. So do you have any advice for someone who is wanting to be more of an advocate in their role, but perhaps is may feel the risk internally of their own organization not wanting them to get too loud, or their funder,
Yeah.
those kinds of tensions. Do you have any advice or ideas there?
Yeah, I think realistically, not all organizations are going to be on side with giving people the ability to speak very publicly about what they're seeing. Again, I get the fear. I don't think it should exist to the extent that it does, but I do understand it. If you do not have support within your organization, there are groups out there that are looking for people just like you. The Shelter and Housing Justice Network, for example, in Toronto. Absolutely join, because then you're joining other people, and you don't necessarily have to be at the forefront yourself if you're worried about visibility and that impacting your job, or your life negatively somehow. You can work behind the scenes with these kinds of advocate groups around issues that you're passionate about. And they can also provide a screen for you. So it's not directly, Diana Chan McNally working for All Saints Church Community Center. Maybe it's Diana Chan McNally working with Shelter and Housing Justice Network. And so that becomes the shield, because it's an external group. So look for those opportunities wherever it is that you are. And if they don't exist, try to find like-minded people, and start to have discussions again, what you would like to see. In terms of getting people to take you seriously, that's a bit trickier, and I'm very well aware of that. I think I got a little bit lucky insofar as I was pushed directly into doing this work. I'm not sure if I hadn't had that forced on me essentially as a condition of my work, that not necessarily I would have been taken as seriously as I am. So I do have that kind of luck there, I think, in that particular example. But what journalists look for is someone who's easy to talk to and well-spoken. And they want sound bites that are juicy. So I'll put that forward to you as well. Like if you're working with a group, you're issuing a press release, somebody bites a journalist, really consider the key messages that you want to communicate, and really consider what is going to make a really juicy soundbite for that person to actually want to include in their article or their news program, what have you. Establishing good relationships with journalists is really important. I'm somebody who has like pretty good relationships with a lot of journalists who will often now come to me first around these issues. Again, also because there's so few people doing it. So it's not because I'm so great, it's because we have nobody or very few people because of the conditions of our work. But that said, if you try to build those relationships, then you can become a voice on these issues as well, if you're comfortable with being highlighted and it's okay with you in terms of the risk.
This one is more of a comment, but I think that you'll have a perspective on this. Self-advocacy doesn't work for BIPOC communities. And this is someone speaking from experience. So because you've talked about just the credibility of being the frontline worker and doing the advocacy, but all of these experiences are intermediated by race, by gender, by identities. And so can you speak to some of those layers?
Yeah, I mean, I'm someone who presents extremely white, and that works to my benefit. That for a long time, journalists would ask me very ambiguous, weird questions about what my ethnic background was. where I had to clarify at a certain point that yes, I am actually mixed race, but I am extremely white presenting, and that worked to my advantage, sadly, because of the systems that we exist in. When I was working with African refugees in particular, it was really important that I was not the primary voice in the room talking about this, because it's not my community directly. It was just a situation I saw that was extremely horrific. And it was important to, again, elevate the voices of those who were directly impacted, which were folks from Africa, either newly arrived or who had had experiences as refugees and were now helming organizations themselves. So this is not work for you to do, but it's work for us to do, who do have that privilege and platform to be able to use that to lift other people up, which unfortunately we don't see enough of, and that's the honest truth. But how to motivate people to do that and to be cognizant that you don't necessarily have to be the person talking. In fact, you shouldn't be the person talking a lot of the time. That's maybe work I can start doing a bit more on my end as well, so that we can actually, again, bring the voices of people who are not heard to the forefront. So that's not a great answer. It's just a recognition that it is very unequal.
It is unequal, and I think the onus is on those who do have access to those conversations to step back and create other space and not take up the space. And as Matri, we're conscious of that. How do we not take up where we shouldn't be, and not just not take it up, but actively identify where there's capacity and where to build capacity to do that work and to have that voice, because it's so incredibly important. And it speaks to a question someone else was asking, is how do those in positions of privilege or power help amplify the voices of the front line or peers with lived experience in a manner that doesn't tokenize them? And I think that's a big part. It's the how as well. It's not just it's how.
Yeah, and I do want to add a comment there about the tokenization as well. So one thing that I'm really sensitive about, and I'm also someone who did experience homelessness as a youth, to the point where I've like in and out of children's aid, and I actually lost custody of my own child because of it. So, I don't talk about that a lot. And not because I'm overly sensitive about it, but because I recognize that we often put the onus on people experiencing bad situations to just re-traumatize themselves, telling the same stories again and again and again, which, why do we need to do that in order to understand that someone's a human being who has human rights that should be upheld and respected? I don't like that, because I just think it's completely unnecessary, and actually it kind of perpetuates this idea that you have to be deserving because you've gone through just enough, that only because of that you require or deserve certain resources. So around the tokenization, it's also just building people's capacity to go beyond being told, can you tell your story to people and humanize yourself to them, even though you are a human being, but rather, again, to kind of build that political knowledge as well. I think it's really important. So when I am working with people, I very much stay away from that kind of stuff unless it's something someone really wants to share. It's not obligatory, and it should never be obligatory.
Absolutely. So we've covered off a lot of different questions. We have about 5 minutes left. I guess there's so many different ways that we can advocate, and you've talked about some very strategic ways of getting right in there and working with counselors and leveraging opportunities. What are some of the more everyday things that more people can access or start with, like petitions and letter writing? And you started by talking about holding a placard and showing up at the thing. Are those all valuable as well? Is that the way to get started and to build confidence in having a voice around public decisions?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, though, with petitions, great, absolutely no problem, especially if someone like a politician is getting just inundated with the same petition. They will be obligated to respond, but it is actually better to call. It is actually much better to write a personalized email. So even if you have that form, for example, you might want to customize it, because someone will be obligated to actually respond to you individually if you do that. So again, I know this from working inside Queen's Park, is there are levels to how seriously you take certain kinds of engagements. Petitions, yes, but usually someone will reply in bulk to everybody who sent it. So it's not a personalized email that you're going to get in response. So personalize it, call if you can, show up to the office if you can. Those are really good ways to start to step it up. And there are organizations too that are also trying to build capacity for people. So Progress Toronto, for one, does a lot of trainings around deputations, for example, understanding how City Hall works. I'd like to see more of this kind of education expanded. Maitrey does some of this too, no? Am I wrong?
Well,
Yeah,
we have a Matrix Policy School and a couple of other ways that we help grantees, but there's room for more.
there's a lot more room for this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It's a good way to get started though, and also to look at who is creating these petitions. Is it like TTC riders, or who is it? And if you like what you're seeing, it might be somewhere or someone that you want to reach out to and be more directly involved. But it's a good start, and it does help. I know oftentimes with people ask me about petitions, they're like, does it even matter? If everyone's sending them, you have like 20,000 people sending it, yeah, it starts to matter. It's actually about the bulk. That starts to put pressure on people.
Yeah. It's getting voices heard in different ways, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. And so you've touched on this question a little bit, and it's do you have advice for fellow community workers on balancing? You just talked about the further education. There's formal education. They're saying that they're looking at your CV, and you've got all these degrees, and that's great and cool. But I think you've just touched on, like, how do you build your capacity, your competencies? And it doesn't have to be through a degree program, it can be, but how do you balance that when you're in the thick of the work? And that's maybe a more of a personal question. Like, how do you manage your own career path when you're trying to do both things?
I don't know that I am. I think I'm mismanaging it a little bit. I have a bunch of degrees, none of which are applicable at all to what I'm doing. So it's there, and that was an entirely different life, although not entirely. I think whatever your background is, there are skill sets that you can bring to this work. This is why community work is great, and you can leverage that into other things. So I actually used to be a graphic designer. I don't know, and I used to be a teacher. Those are communications roles. Graphic design is all about distilling content down to its most singular forms and communicating that visually in a very clear way. And being a teacher is being able to teach concepts in a very clear way using plain language. So even though really I don't do these things anymore, they do help in terms of knowing how to communicate things effectively. I often think like a graphic designer or a teacher about what's the best way to actually kind of take these messages and put them toward the public. So that's my particular background. But whatever it is that you've done, you can contribute in some way. So rallies, for example, we often have like people who are playing music. If you're a musician, that's something that you can contribute as well. What are the skill sets that you can bring? Are you a carpenter? Do you have really great skills building things? We often need props and signage and that kind of stuff also created as well. So consider what it is that you already are good at and can do, and how can you translate that into this space as well, because all skill sets actually are very valuable in the kind of work that we do.
Terrific. So we're at time. I want to give you a chance for a final word. Before you give your final word, I just want to say you're getting in the Q&A box. It's not all Q&A. There's a wonderful thank you from the African Centre for Refugees in Ontario and Canada, who are thanking you for the hard work that you've done, and an invitation to see if you would ever want to get into benefit design work at the macro level. All kinds of stuff that cool. I think people want to pull you into their work, and because you're so great at what you're doing. But do you have a final comment on the role of the advocate?
It's a bit of a tangent, but I feel like I should touch on this because we live in a world of social media as our mirror world. Not to reference Naomi Klein, reference her a little bit here. A lot of people think that just being active on something like Twitter, social media more generally, that in itself is enough. It's not a replacement for hitting the streets and having conversations with people in real life. And importantly, online discourse and whatever sentiment that you're seeing out there is never indicative of what people actually think or how they feel in the real world. It is always extremely distorted. So the secret, and I have a lot of Twitter followers for some reason, I guess they like what I'm doing. The secret, however, is that everyone thinks that if you have thousands of followers, that you're an important voice. It's not necessarily true. And I think if we looked at the Toronto mayoral elections, and there are certain candidates who had massive platforms who got like 0 votes, these are not related at all. But if you are someone who has like some kind of social media platform, it technically isn't important, but people in real life will see that and somehow mistake that you're important because of it. If that makes any sense at all. So take organizing on social media and social media campaigns with a grain of salt. Take it with a big grain of salt. But you can use that platform to actually command respect from people in real life. So that's my secret too, is it doesn't actually really matter whatever it is that you say online. It doesn't really have a huge impact on things, but other people believe that it does. Does that make sense?
That's a great place to finish off. Thank you.
Okay.